Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Gopi Jana Vallabha Giri Varadari Jaya Gopi Jana Vallabha Giri Varadari Yashodanandana Braja Jana Ranjana Yashodanandana Braja Jana Ranjana Yamuna Tira Vanachari Yamuna Tira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Gopi Jana Vallabha Giri Varadari Jaya Gopi Jana Vallabha Giri Varadari Yashodanandana Braja Jana Ranjana Yashodanandana Braja Jana Ranjana Yamuna Tira Vanachari Yamuna Tira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Shri Radha Madhava ki Jaya Om Vishnu Pada Paramamsa Parivrakacharya Stottara Shata Shri Mad A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada ki BBT founder Srila Prabhupada ki ISKCON Samstapakacharya Srila Prabhupada ki Senapati Bhakta Srila Prabhupada ki Mantra Upasaka Srila Prabhupada ki Preeminent Shiksha Guru Srila Prabhupada ki Savior of the whole world Srila Prabhupada ki Jaya Om Vishnu Pada Paramamsa Parivrakacharya Stottara Shata Shri Mad Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Goswami Maharaj Prabhupada ki, Namacharya Srila Haridas Thakur ki, Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda ki, Prem se kaho Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadara Shivasari Gaura Bhakta Vrinda ki, Shri Shri Gopa Gopinath Shamakund Radhakund Giri Govardhan ki, Shri Vrindavan Dham ki, Mayapur Dham ki, Ganga Maya ki, Yamuna Maya ki, Tulsi Maharani ki, Samaveta Bhakta Vrinda ki, Gaura Premanande, all glories to assembled devotees, all glories to assembled devotees, all glories to assembled devotees, all glories to Sri Guru and Sri Gauranga, all glory to Srila Prabhupada. Today we are reading from Srila Prabhupada's Lilamrta, chapter entitled Jet Age Parivrakacharya. We can say Prabhupada's prana mantras together. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prastaya Bhutale Srimati Bhakti Vedanta Swaminiti Namine Namaste Saraswate Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Pashtata Deshatarine. We will continue reading. After only 3 days, Prabhupada's mission in Moscow seemed finished. The meeting with Professor Kotovsky over what was left. The government would allow nothing else. It had not allowed him to bring in books, and now he had been refused the opportunity to speak publicly. Foreigners were not to talk with the Russians. He could go nowhere unless on an accompanied tour. So with no preaching and no prospects, he stayed in his cramped room, taking his massage, bathing, accepting whatever food Shyamasundar could gather and cook, dictating a few letters, chanting Hare Krishna, and translating Srimad Bhagavatam. Prabhupada took a guided tour of Moscow, riding with other tourists on a crowded bus. He saw elderly Russians going to church, armed guards stationed at the door, and he surmised that the guards were to prevent the younger generation from entering to worship. He soon tired of the tour, however, and the tour guide got him a taxi and instructed the driver to return him to the Hotel National. Shyamasundara continued to spend most of his day looking for fresh food. Hearing that oranges were available at a certain market across town, he set out across the city. With his shaved head and his white dhoti and kurta, he drew stares from everyone he passed. And as he was returning after dark, uniformed men wearing red armbands accosted him, taking him to be a local deviant. Grabbing him, they pinned his arms behind his back and shouted at him in Russian. Shyamasundar caught the word "document," document, passport. It applied document, hotel, hotel. Realizing Shyamasundar was a tourist, the officers released him and he returned to the hotel and informed Prabhupada of what had taken place. There is no hope in Russia without Krishna consciousness, Prabhupada said. One Shyamasundar was standing in line at a yogurt store when a man behind him asked him about yoga. "I really want to talk with you," the man said. and he gave Shamasundar his name and address and a time they could safely meet. When Shamasundar told Prabhupada, Prabhupada said, "No, he is a policeman, don't go." Standing at his window, Prabhupada glimpsed a parade in nearby Red Square, troops, tanks, artillery, and missiles parading through the streets. "We're always preparing for war," Prabhupada said. The Russian leaders kept the people motivated and thus avoided a revolt. He compared warlike Russia to the Asuras, demons, in the ancient Vedic histories of like Srimad Bhagavatam. One day, two young men, one the son of an Indian diplomat stationed in Moscow, the other a young Muscovite, were loitering near Red Square when they saw an amazing sight. Out of the usual regiment routine of the city traffic, a tall young man with a shaved head, a long reddish ponytail, and flowing white robes approached. It was Shamasundar. Familiar with Shamasundar's dress, the son of the Indian diplomat stopped him. Shamasundar smiled, "Hare Krishna, brother," and he began talking with the Indian, whose name was Narayana. The Russian, Ivan, knew a little English and followed the conversation as closely as he could. The talk grew serious. "Why don't you come up and meet my spiritual master?" Shamasundar asked. Honored, the boys immediately accompanied Shamasundar to the Hotel National. When they arrived, they found Prabhupada seated on his bed, aglow and smiling, Aravinda massaging his feet. Shamasundar entered, offering obeisances before Prabhupada. Ivan was completely fascinated. "Come on," Prabhupada said, and the three of them sat at Prabhupada's feet. Turning first to Narayan, Prabhupada asked his name and his father's occupation. Narayana, like Prabhupada, and offered to bring him green vegetables, his father, being highly placed at the Indian embassy, had produce flown in from India. Ivan was interested even more than his Indian friend, and Prabhupada began explaining to him the philosophy of Krishna consciousness. While Narayana helped by translating, Ivan inquired with respect and awe, and Prabhupada answered his questions, teaching as much basic information about Krishna consciousness as was possible in one sitting. Prabhupada explained the difference between the spirit soul and the body and described the soul's eternal relationship with Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. He spoke of Bhagavad Gita, of his network of temples around the world, and of his young men and women disciples, all practicing bhakti yoga. Prabhupada mentioned his desire to preach in Russia, which was a great field for Krishna consciousness, because the people were open-minded and hadn't been polluted by sense gratification. He wanted to introduce Krishna consciousness literature in Russia through a library or a reading room, or in whatever way possible. Krishna conscious philosophy, he said, should be taught to Russia's most intelligent people, but because of government restrictions, it would have to be done discreetly. Devotees would not be able to sing and dance in the streets, but they could chant quietly together in someone's room, in someone's home. Prabhupada then began singing very quietly, leading the boys in kirtan. Ivan's taking to Krishna was like a hungry man's eating a meal. After several hours, however, he and his friend had to go. They would return the next day. Shamasundar began spending time with Ivan and Narayana. Ivan a student of Oriental philosophies, was very intelligent and eager to know what was going on in the outside world. He was fond of the Beatles, and Prabhupada told him of his association with George Harrison and John Lennon. Ivan and Shamasundar had long talks about the ambitions and hopes of young people outside Russia, and Shamasundar explained to him how Krishna consciousness was the topmost of all spiritual paths. Shamasundar also taught him basic principles of bhakti yoga, such as chanting the prescribed 16 rounds of japa daily, and gave him his own copy of Bhagavad Gita as it is. Prabhupada showed Ivan how to prepare chapatis and rice and asked him to give up eating meat. Joyfully, Ivan accepted the chanting, the new way of eating everything. Ivan was being trained so that after Prabhupada left, Ivan could continue on his own. Ivan would be able to feel himself changing and advancing in spiritual life. And after practicing for some time, he could be initiated. Ivan said he would tell his friends about Krishna consciousness, but only 2 days left in Moscow. Prabhupada taught Ivan as much as he could. In this young Russian's eagerness and intelligence, Prabhupada found the real purpose of his visit to Russia. Prabhupada gave the analogy that when cooking rice, the cook need test only one grain to determine whether the whole pot of rice is done. Similarly, by talking with this one Russian youth, Prabhupada could tell that the Russian people were not satisfied in their so-called ideal land of Marxism. Just as Ivan was keenly receptive to Krishna consciousness, millions of other Russians would be also. Chanakya Pandit says that one blooming flower can refresh a whole forest, and that a fire in a single tree can burn the whole forest. From the Marxist point of view, Ivan was the fire that could spread Krishna consciousness to others, thus defeating the communist ideology. And from Prabhupada's point of view, he was the aromatic flower that could lend its fragrance to many others. Prabhupada's visit to Russia was no obscure interlude, but had become an occasion for planting the seed of Krishna consciousness in a destitute land. Srila Prabhupada had brought the movement of Lord Chaitanya to yet another country. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu himself had predicted that the Sankirtan movement would go to every town and village. Yet for hundreds of years, that prediction had remained unfulfilled. Prabhupada, however, in the few years since his first trip to America in 1965, he had again and again planted Lord Chaitanya's message in one unlikely place after another. And of all places, this was perhaps the most unlikely. During a brief government-supervised visit to Moscow, he had planted the seed of Krishna consciousness within the Soviet Union. He was like the needle, and everyone and everything connected with him was like the thread that would follow. Professor Kotovsky had remarked that Prabhupada's stay in an old-fashioned hotel would not prove very interesting, but Prabhupada, unknown to Professor Kotovsky, was transcendental to Moscow or any other place in the material world. Prabhupada had come to this place, and Krishna had sent a sincere soul to him to receive the gift of Krishna consciousness. This had happened not by devious espionage against the Soviet government, but by the presence of Krishna's pure devotee and his natural desire to satisfy Krishna by preaching. In response to Prabhupada's pure desire, Krishna had sent one boy, and from that one boy, the desire would spread to others. Nothing, not even an iron curtain, would stop Krishna consciousness. The soul's natural function was to serve Krishna, and Krishna's natural will was to satisfy the pure desires of his devotee. In a farewell letter to Professor Kotovsky, Prabhupada tried to encourage further correspondence. You wanted to see the manuscripts of my lectures, therefore I am sending herewith an introduction to the lectures, and if you so desire, I shall be glad to send essays on these subjects. 1. Vedic conceptions of socialism and communism. 2. Scientific values of classless society. 3. Knowledge of authoritative tradition. In a letter to Tamal Krishna, Prabhupada summed up his Moscow visit. The city is well planned. There are big houses and roads, and at daytime the streets are busy with buses, cars and underground trains, which are far better than American or English. The underground streets are very neat and clean. The surface streets are also daily washed. But there is some difficulty in collecting vegetarian foodstuffs. Still, we are cooking our meals by the cooker which has saved our lives. We talked with one big professor, Mr. Kotovsky, and Shyama Sundar talked with many great writers and musicians. Shri Shri Radha Radhanath Ki. Two boys are working with us, one Indian and one Russian. So there is good prospect for opening a center. Although the atmosphere is not very good, the embassy was no help. So our visit to Moscow was not so successful. But for the future, it is hopeful. Tomorrow I go to Paris for one day, then to San Francisco Rath Yatra, and then I shall come back to London. Paris, June 25, 1971. Srila Prabhupada was lying on the couch in the conference room of the Indian Tourist Office. Having just come from Oli Airport, two disciples, Aradhana and his wife, Shantanu, had come with him in the taxi and were the only others in the room. Since there was to be a press conference later, Prabhupada said he wanted to rest, and he closed his eyes. At the airport, Paris immigration officials had detained Prabhupada while some 30 European devotees, none of whom had ever met him, had waited anxiously. They had glimpsed him as he had walked from the plane to the terminal building, and they had watched him carrying his sannyas danda with umbrella strapped to it. He had waved to them, holding up his bead bag, but then he had been kept from them, just beyond a thin wall, until finally, after 2 hours, Paris immigration had allowed him through. The Paris devotees had not arranged a car for Prabhupada, so when he had asked for one, several devotees had run off to hail a taxi. When a taxi had arrived, Prabhupada, along with Aradhan and Shantanu, had started for the Indian Tourist Office, leaving the others to join him later. After a brief rest, Prabhupada opened his eyes and saw Aradhan, Shantanu, and Shama Sundar in the room. The other devotees and the press would be arriving soon. As Prabhupada sat up, Shantanu offered him some mango, and Prabhupada smiled. Yogeshwara. I sat outside the door to Prabhupada's room, eating the peel of the mango Prabhupada had eaten. My heart was pounding, and I had no idea what it was going to be like after having been initiated for a year and a half, and having never met my spiritual master personally, but now knowing that he was just behind that door. Then Shyamasundar opened the door and peered out and saw me sitting there. He stuck his head back inside the door and said, "There's a devotee here. Shall I let him in now?" Srila Prabhupada. I peeked around the door, and Srila Prabhupada, who had been lying down on the couch, was now sitting up with his hand on his knee very solidly, with a royal majestic look. He responded to Shyamasundara's question by motioning with his hand that we could all come in. It was the first perfect thing I had ever seen in my life, that one gesture. So I came in and immediately fell flat on the floor, and then I understood that now I am with my spiritual master. Gradually the devotees began arriving from the airport, and they came into Prabhupada's room. The press also arrived as Prabhupada spoke warmly and pleasantly with his followers, encouraging them in their preaching and telling them of his own recent preaching in Moscow. Hardly any of the devotees had ever been with their spiritual master before, and Lochananda began introducing them to Srila Prabhupada. Harivilas. I arrived late, and when I came in, I was mixed up with surprise, with elation, with egotistical pride, and with amazement that the Lord's pure devotee was there. I walked in with Ganashyam, the boy who had started translating some of Prabhupada's books into French. The room was almost full, and Ganashyam immediately sat down in the back. I was the president of the temple, and I was very proud and puffed up about it. So I made my way all the way up to the front where Srila Prabhupada was, and I sat down right next to him. I looked at him, expecting him to look at me and smile or something, some recognition, but he didn't look at me at all. Lochananda was introducing all the devotees to Prabhupada. Lochananda said, "This is Ganashyam. He is the translator." Prabhupada said, Where is he? And everyone looked around to Ganashyam in the back. Prabhupada said, "Let him stand up, please." Ganashyam stood, and Prabhupada looked at him and smiled and said, "Oh, thank you very much." Right then I felt a little funny. I sat there wondering, what have I done? I walked all the way up to the front, and I'm expecting so much recognition. Then Lochananda said, "This is Hari Vilas. He is the president of the temple." Prabhupada didn't even look at me, and I knew, yes, I had made a big mistake. I began to realize, this is my spiritual master. Because immediately he had acted in such a way as to point out a great fault in me. Reporters began their questioning, and Prabhupada patiently answered them, taking advantage of their sometimes superficial questions to elaborate on the philosophy of Krishna consciousness and explain the Krishna consciousness movement. The conference ran 1 hour. As Prabhupada left the Indian tourist office, he found that there was no car to take him to the temple. while several devotees ran around trying to find a taxi. Prabhupada waited, standing before a sidewalk cafe, thinking that Prabhupada must be tired from the rigorous press conference and his long flight from Moscow. One of the devotees asked, "Srila Prabhupada, would you like to sit here for a minute?" And the devotees pulled one of the cafe chairs out away from its table. "What is this place?" Prabhupada asked. "This is a sidewalk cafe," the devotee replied. "What do people do here? Do they smoke and drink?" "Yes, Srila Prabhupada, it's a cafe. They serve alcoholic beverages." "No," Prabhupada replied. "Guru cannot sit in such a place." When Prabhupada reached the temple, he bathed and took prasadam. The next day, he was scheduled to leave for Los Angeles, and his one day in Paris was filled with outside engagements. He rested and again went out to preach. The devotees had rented the Olympia Theatre, a large auditorium meant to seat more than 2,000. But because the devotees had advertised Prabhupada's lecture only 2 days in advance, only 40 people attended. Prabhupada was undaunted, and he lectured and held kirtan. Afterward, he went to a television studio for an interview. By the time Prabhupada returned to the temple, it was 1 in the morning. Shyamasundar told the devotees, who had all accompanied Prabhupada during the day, that they should rest a full 6 hours before rising. But the next morning, Prabhupada rose as usual. And at 5 o'clock, he was demanding to know why there was no Mangal Arati. He sent his servant to wake the devotees, and as the devotees were hurrying to the temple room to begin their morning worship, Prabhupada was going out on his morning walk. Accompanying Prabhupada on his walk were Shyamasundar, Aravinda, and the Paris temple president, Hari Vilas. The spring morning was sunny, and Prabhupada, walking with his cane, appeared noble. "Shyamasundar," Prabhupada asked, "why are all the householders in Maya?" And Shyamasundar couldn't reply. Prabhupada said, "That's all right. That is their position, to be in Maya." He said that when he had gone to America, his plans had been to make sannyasis. But when he saw the free mixing of the sexes in the West, he had decided to let his disciples first get married and have a child, and then the wife could go to Vrindavan with the child, and the husband could take sannyas. Prabhupada laughed. "Man becomes entangled by his family," he said, "by his home, his bank account, his animals, and so many other attachments." Near the end of his walk, Prabhupada spoke specifically of Paris. "3 things are prominent here," he said: wine, woman, and money. "What do you think, Hari Vilas? Is this a fact?" Hari Vilas replied, "Yes, Prabhupada, this is definitely a fact. Wine, woman, and money." Prabhupada said that although these attachments were very strong, the Krishna consciousness movement could overcome their influence. Prabhupada said that the houses in the Paris suburb with their attractive fenced-in yards were excellent, but everything was being wasted for sense gratification. Although a French gentleman may have such a first-class house, garden, wife, bank account, and car, he has no spiritual knowledge. Therefore, he would always remain attached to his first-class possessions. And at the end of his life, his great attachment would lead him to take birth as a cockroach or rat or dog within the same house. As Prabhupada and the devotees continued walking. Prabhupada asked Hari Vilas how he thought the temple's preaching was faring. Hari Vilas said he thought it would be successful, but that it might be a good idea to make extra income by starting a business. Your business is preaching, Prabhupada said. If there are some householders, they can do business. When Prabhupada and his party arrived at the temple, they found the devotees eagerly waiting for Prabhupada's morning Bhagavatam lecture. But there was no time. Prabhupada had to leave at once for the airport. He was returning to America. I'll stop over here. Hare Krishna.